Good afternoon, everyone. I'll just wait one more minute for any other participants, and then we'll kick off. Thanks. Okay, I think it's time to start. Before we do start this webinar, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which we're all meeting today. In my case, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. My name is Jeremy Sewell, and I'm the Head of Policy at the Energy Efficiency Council, or the EEC as we go for short here in the slide there. Why is the EEC interested in the topic of embodied carbon? Well, we are the peak body for energy performance in Australia, and our interest is in decarbonisation through energy efficiency, electrification, and demand flexibility across all sectors of the economy, from the built environment to industry. Now, while in the built environment, we're primarily interested in reducing the operational emissions of buildings by improving the energy performance of those buildings. When you start thinking about the embodied carbon of the building materials, it compels you to think about what's happening upstream in parts of the economy that manufacture, construct, and transport those materials. And those are many parts of the economy where we think there are equally large opportunities for cutting emissions through energy performance. So the topic of embodied carbon really brings together, I suppose, our interest in multiple sectors of the economy. And so we're delighted to be hosting this webinar today on some tools and policies for reducing embodied carbon in Australia's built environment. It's a fast moving space at the moment, with Australia's net zero targets becoming closer and closer. And it's a real case of all hands on deck, including everyone across the built environment, but also industry. And this topic is a real hot topic at the moment. We've just had a very big forum of academics here in Melbourne just 2 weeks ago discussing it, and also at our own Building Energy Performance Summit that the EEC hosted. We were very lucky to have the Assistant Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Josh Wilson, launch the NABERS Embodied Carbon tool that we're going to be hearing about shortly from James. So today we have three excellent speakers on the agenda. First, we're going to hear about the context for managing embodied carbon in Australia, and that's going to be a short presentation from Jorge Chapa, who is the Chief Impact Officer at GBCA. Then we're going to hear about the NABERS Embodied Carbon Rating tool from James Elks, who is the Acting Director at NABERS currently. And finally, we'll hear from our friends at the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, and Alison Scotland, their CEO, is here to talk about a policy roadmap for managing embodied carbon that's set to be released next year. A short bit of housekeeping before I introduce formally our first speaker. If you have questions on anything that comes up, please pose those using the Q&A function of Zoom. And we have someone standing by to bring those questions to our attention. And finally, just to let you know, those of you who joined a little bit late, that this session is being recorded and that the recording will be made available on our website tomorrow, I believe. So let's get started now with our first speaker, Jorge, who's going to provide some context for the embodied carbon tools and policies we're about to hear about. Jorge brings a global perspective to this issue because, in addition to his role at the Green Building Council of Australia, he chairs the World Green Building Council's Global Commitment for Net Zero Carbon Buildings Task Force and the World GBC's ESG Working Group. He's also a member of the Climate Bond Initiative's Low Carbon Building Technical Working Group, Climate Risk Real Estate Monitors Global Industry Committee, and the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative's technical working group focused on the built environment. So Jorge, you're in a fantastic position to give us the context here about why we should care about embodied carbon, and I'd like to hand the floor to you.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thanks everyone for having us here. I will briefly apologize. I'm actually coming out of a bout with COVID, everyone's favorite friend. And so I may have to just mute myself briefly when it comes to just having a bit of a coughing fit. I am in good spirits and I'm in good health now, just the remaining infection. I will be sharing my screen, and if I could just get a thumbs up from EEC that you can indeed see this properly. Is that correct? I'm going to assume the answer is yes.
Yep.
Thank you. Excellent. Thanks, Jeremy. All right. So embodied carbon, global outlook, what's going on? First, a bit for those of you who don't know, who is the Green Building Council of Australia. We're an industry association dedicated to transforming the built environment. We've been around now for more than 20 years. 22 to be precise, and our claim to fame is we came from the Green Olympics, right? Green Olympics happens. People really thought what happened then as the first Green Olympics in Sydney, that there was merit in continuing all of that work. Green Building Council was created. We have 4 key areas of activity. We advocate to local, state, and federal government. We do a lot of courses, training, seminars like this. We do a lot of collaboration. Everyone that is in presenting today, we collaborate strongly to make sure that we're all aligned, we're all working together towards the same goal. And we're very well known for our rating system, Green Star, of which I'll talk about later in a second. Why embodied carbon, right? The term embodied carbon is not new. People have been talking about embodied carbon for years, but it's probably one of the most misunderstood things in the built environment. This is an article that came out in Tree Hugger, an environmental blog from an architect called Lloyd Alter, a few years back, and we were talking about why people weren't really thinking about embodied carbon as a key thing. And one of the key elements about it is that we tend to think of embodied carbon as something that happens and then is spread out across the lifetime of the building somehow, but it's not entirely true. And realistically speaking, we also haven't focused on embodied carbon because it hasn't been seen as a big source of emissions for a long time. It was a significant source of emissions, but compared to the other challenges that we had, it wasn't where we were placing our efforts in. That's changed, and that's changed a lot in the past few years. Mid-2019, at the same time as this conversation was happening, let's say in the green building movement through Lloyd, World Green Building Council, and we launched this document, which is called Bringing Embodied Carbon Up Front. And what it tries to outline is to say, hey, it's great that we're focusing on operating emissions, and we should continue focusing on operating emissions. But there's this thing about embodied carbon, which is very unique. It's really, really hard to abate, right? If you think about the fact that buildings account for 40% of all energy-related global carbon emissions, this report found that 25% of that, 40% of about 10% of the globe's emissions are embodied carbon. And that actually represents something like 50% of all consumption that happens in the planet. And that 10% of emissions is just hard to abate. We can, at any given point in time, change the emissions profile, the operating emissions profile of a building. And I'll show exactly what we mean by that. But it's not easy to do when we're talking about changing the emissions profile of a building. And furthermore, you only get one shot at changing that emissions profile. And that's a very unique situation. So 10% of, say, or a quarter of the building's emissions are embodied carbon when we were doing this report. And that doesn't sound like much, but you only get one chance. And that's an important thing to consider. So we did a bit of work. We did this report with ThinkStep Inside. This is the Green Building Council of Australia, around embodied carbon and embodied energy in Australia's buildings. And so we did a bit of forecasting. And we said, if we look at all of Australia's emissions, how much of the emissions are operating emissions? And the answer was 84%. And right now it's probably about as much. Only 16% is embodied carbon. But if you throw your mind forward, if you do a bit of future casting, you find that it's 85% becomes embodied carbon. Now, what's changed? And the best way that I can represent this is through a bit of calculations that happens when you think about it in just a building. So we did a bit of work in GBCA, again, a few years back, where we looked at a bunch of sources and sort of said, look, best as we can gather, this is what a typical building looks like in 2020. It's a tenanted building, it's in Sydney, and we're making a lot of assumptions, but that's important, right? We're making a lot of assumptions, but it kind of holds. Most of the emissions are electricity and other fuels, a little bit of refrigerants, a little bit of waste to landfill, and about 20% of that is product material manufacturing and use. And that actually seems to have been consistent in 2020. And you'll see that there's scope 2 and 3 and so on, but just ignore that for a second. But is that always the case, right? And we looked at this situation. We did the modeling around 2020, and you can see that green line there. And that green line represents what the expected projections of the electricity grid were going to be back then in 2020. When we looked at that number, we came up with those percentages. Here's the thing. A year later, we had the step change scenario from AMO, and that showed a much more drastic reduction in the emissions profile of the grid. So we take that building, we apply revised factors, exact same building, but the emissions profile is different. And that continues to tell you that changing embodied carbon or the upfront carbon is really important, but we shouldn't be trading off operating emissions through embodied emissions. We have to start treating them separately. We have to start taking them into account by themselves, because we only get one shot at doing this. And when you look at where the upfront carbon is, you start really realizing why this is the case. Most of the embodied carbon in a building is in the superstructure and the substructure. 50% of, or more than 50% of it is in those elements. You add the envelope and facade and you get to 65, 70%. But we don't change a building structure over the lifetime of the building. We said it once. We started looking at this problem as well a few years back. We've done a revision to Green Star recently. It's in Green Star buildings. So in 2020, we launched a change to Green Star buildings on the basis that we needed to tackle the upfront carbon problem. On the same logic, right? We can bend operating emissions at any point in time in the building's lifetime, or mostly we can. We get a few shots at doing that. If it's we can change the emissions profile of the grid, we can electrify the building, we can improve the mechanical systems every 10, 15 years. We might be able to improve the facade every 30 years or so. So there's options to change it, but we can't change the upfront carbon. That's it. We can't do anything about that. We introduce a credit and a requirement in Green Star called upfront carbon emissions. There's a requirement that you have to do 10% reduced emissions over a typical reference building. And we ended up with a bit of a hiccup, essentially, which is how do we define a reference building? So we have a methodology, we work through it, but then we approach NABERS, and James will talk a lot more about that, which is how do we solve the problem? Because it's not good enough that we have a reference building. You can do a lot of things to that reference building to make it look like it has more upfront carbon and not really change your process. So we're very excited about the work that NABERS is doing, that we're integrating into Green Star to have ideally a fixed benchmark for the building. We've done that across the buildings range too, but the embodied carbon question also shows up in communities and fit outs. We also have credits that specifically ask for environmental product declarations in buildings, because we're trying to get and encourage the manufacturers to provide that information to the building sector. Now here's the kicker. You might say, so what? What you have on your screen are all of the frameworks that currently are driving action on upfront carbon today. So if you're an investor, you have, and you're securing sustainable finance, and your investors from overseas, the European taxonomy requires you to care. Or in the next year, the Australian one will care. Science-based targets requires you to look at your embodied carbon emissions. GRESB, which is a reporting framework for the built environment, requires you to disclose, or is going to ask for disclosures around embodied carbon to themselves. Accounting standards like the International Sustainability Standards Board now require you to report on your scope 3 emissions, of which embodied carbon for real estate companies that do developments is the largest majority of emissions. We have the same thing in Australia through mandatory climate-related financial disclosures. All of these things are asking changes to upfront carbon. none of these required upfront carbon disclosures or measurements before 2021. And that is really important to understand. This is an area that you probably are seeing now as a gigantic, where there's been a gigantic increase in activity. And the reason for that is none of these things, none of these frameworks required the upfront amending or doing any activity on upfront carbon emissions. So that explains the change in what you're seeing. We really now care about upfront carbon because we're moving to a situation where for us to try and limit the effects of global warming in the future, we have to reduce emissions now. And while upfront carbon may not appear to be a large enough source of emissions, the fact that we only get a chance to fix it once, essentially or effectively, in a building means that we have to think very strongly about how to reduce those emissions as quickly as we can, because that gives us the opportunity to then create space for other activities to happen in the future. If you're interested in learning more about upfront carbon, I hope you don't mind me plugging this, Jeremy, but there's a great guide that ourselves, NABERS, and several other entities work together to talk about how to reduce upfront carbon emissions. It is a very practical guide. It gives you a lot of very useful information, and it's available on our website if you want to take a look at it. That's it for me. Thank you very much. Jeremy, back to you.
Thank you, Jorge. That was exactly what I was hoping you'd be able to present to our audience today, a bit of the global landscape. And we'll come back to that because I have a few questions around international drivers and also demand from international clients in Australian buildings as well, based on the fact that this is happening elsewhere. But before we do, we're going to hand on to our next speaker and we'll leave questions to the end. Just a reminder to everyone, that's the way we're going to run things. Put your questions in the Q&A if you have any for anything you just saw from Jorge's presentation. But next I'd like to introduce our next speaker, James Elks, who is Acting Co-Director at NABERS. And oversees its delivery across Australia at the moment. NABERS, of course, is one of Australia's longest running and most successful sustainability initiatives run by government. It's a rating system that has now been exported overseas as well to the UK, amongst other places it's expanding to. And in his day job, when he's not acting co-director, James leads the product development team of designers and development and of developers managing the technology design and development of new NABERS products. And he oversaw the development of this new NABERS Embodied Carbon rating tool. The old adage of what you don't measure, you don't manage is extremely true, and hence the need for tools such as this to try and get a sense of the level of embodied carbon in buildings, in commercial buildings in particular. And so we're very excited that this tool has been launched. And James is here to tell us a little bit more about the tool. So over to you, James.
And I'm on mute. I've started talking on mute. I was the first one to do it. Thank you, Jeremy. Can you see my screen okay? Can you hear me now?
All good.
Great, thank you. So I've got a few things to talk about today, and I've noticed having a look through the attendees that many of you have heard me talk before, but don't tune out because we have a new, you'd be very excited, we have a new PowerPoint template, not today, but you can look forward to it next time. But I've snuck in some screenshots of both the actual tool itself that's in development at the moment and some of the benchmarking results that we're seeing from the benchmarking process that we're on. That's at the end. So just keep your eyes out for that. And then for the rest of you, I'm going to take you through a little bit about what we've been up to. So we started work on embodied carbon in 2021. And not a lot was happening at that time, and we went out and figured out, do we need to do something, did some consultations, and now we're right into the pointy end of actually delivering a tool that you can use to measure and compare buildings when it comes to embodied carbon. We launched it, as Jeremy said, at the Buildings Energy Performance Summit a couple of weeks ago, which was great. But we didn't like launch it, we kind of launched it. And what that means is that we are really looking for people to come and join and be assessors for us in a course that we're going to run in February. And you know, really the process we've gone through this has involved probably, well, I know lots of people on this call. We've sort of spoken from everyone right from the start of this process. Hey, we're going to build a new building, the building owner. We've gone through the project teams. I'm an architect, I'm an engineer. We've gone through the influencers, the policymakers, and also, of course, the supply side, because in the end, a building is made up of products and we need those products to be low carbon, as well as the building being designed to be low carbon. So what is it that we launched? We launched a national database of default emissions factors. So what we heard from industry was that if you want to measure the carbon in your product, you want to say how much carbon this coffee cup had, then the best way to do that is using an environmental product declaration or an EPD. But not everything has an EPD. This certainly doesn't. Someone made that, I think, by hand. And what do you do if you don't have a number? You use a default. So that's what the emissions database is about. We published our rules as a 90-page rules document, which talks, what it enables is two different people to come, measure the same building and come up with the same result. And what we know is that previously, and up until now, that's been exceptionally difficult. And we have a stable of examples, one of them being a large commercial building in one of the major CBDs. Two different people came and measured the carbon. They came up with two results, and those results were 450% different. So it's it's a major problem. The other thing that the rules have are the documentation requirements. So you're saying that you used an EPD for your steel or your gyprock or something. What evidence do you require to prove that that's true? The training, so that's really, we're going to talk about training in a minute, but we really want people to sign up to train, to learn the framework in detail. And then once the training's done, early next year, February is when that's planned, you'll be able to certify buildings. And pretty much any type of building, there are some exclusions and some notable exclusions, but pretty much any kind of building you'll be able to certify. And that result will be, this building has X number of CO2 equivalent per square meter. And then for some building types, major building types, probably looking at hotels, industrial, offices, those types of things, we'll also have benchmarks or the famous star ratings of NABERS. So the life cycle of the rating, because we get lots of questions about that, because the rating actually happens at the end. So we'll start at the bottom. So you get an embodied carbon rating once your building is built. And you're basically looking back in time, looking at all the stuff that went into the building and saying, we're pretty confident that the amount of carbon that came out of the construction of this building was X. But before that, we really want people thinking that through, right? There's no, we want people to change their behavior as they're both designing and constructing buildings. So we have two things that people can do. They can sign up to a commitment agreement for embodied carbon, same as a commitment agreement for energy, if you're similar with that. It says, we will reach 5 stars or 6 stars or whatever number of stars you would like. It's 1 to 6 stars for NABERS. We will reach that number of stars when this building's constructed. Then you do the as-built, happy. The other products we have, which is typically more used in policy sense, is agreement to rate. And that just says, we will get a rating. We're not going to tell you, we're not sure what it's going to be, but we're definitely going to get one. So essentially, design and construction, those two products, and then embodied carbon. The costs for these, so commitment agreements and agreements to rate are the price that they were previously. Commitment agreements, relatively pricey, $8,375, because it is a big product that does a lot. Happy to talk about that another time. And then agreement to rate, $1,950. The actual rating itself, we've split into sort of smaller buildings and larger buildings. Obviously, well, is it obvious? Lots of buildings that are doing a lot of work with embodied carbon are larger at the moment. And so the price for smaller buildings under 2,000 square meters is, oh, these prices are wrong. $3,660, and more than 2,000 square meters is $4,660, and that's the certification fee. So on to training. So we want people to be assessors. So assessors is tough, and it's really suitable for quantity surveyors, construction professionals, sustainability professionals, but with a background in things like LCA. I'll put a link in the chat actually after I finish talking, and that'll link you straight to the expressions of interest. basically the sign-ups to do the training course, which is $1,200 and we'll be holding in February. The other thing you can do right now is go and download the rules and read those if you're that way inclined. The reason you might want to read those now is to understand what are the evidence requirements. I've got a building, it's being built, I'm writing contracts for a building. What types of things should I be putting in there? So now moving on to the little secret surprise. You know, and this is for the diehards, so I apologize if you're more at the strategic level for embodied carbon, but I know there's people in the calls who wanted to see this. So what we have here is the upfront embodied emissions embodied carbon calculator. It's nowhere near final. You know, please don't share this around. I'll be in big trouble with the team. But essentially, I want to give you a bit of a sense of what it's looking like, because people keep asking. It'll be available early next year. So there's a number of tabs along the bottom. You can see that this is Excel. This is the building attributes or the details of the building. So it's like, what's the name of it? Where is it? How far is it to the nearest port? And we use a lot of this information inside the calculations. How tall is it? What type of building is it? Those types of things. Clicking onto materials, which, you know, to a large extent is, you know, where the rubber hits the road when it comes to embodied carbon. What down the left, you've kind of got what is the section of the building. So it's the superstructure. What's the material type? It's in situ concrete. What strength grade is that? 20 to 25 MPa. And how much have you got of it? It goes on. What type of evidence have you got that you actually put that concrete in? Did you use an EPD or concrete with an EPD, or do you need to use the default factors? There's a bunch of results and shiny graphs and things that sort of split this out in different information. And then there's also a checklist as well. So as you're going through and thinking about what data do I need? How does that need to fit into the calculation? This kind of follows you along. So that's the calculator. I can't really take you through it in much more detail, even separately to this, until next year, but happy to do so at that time. Also sign up for the training. The other thing that we're working really hard on at the moment is the benchmarking. So essentially what that is trying to figure out what drives embodied carbon in buildings. And this series of graphs here is really just to show you that what we're seeing is what we are predicting versus what the actual carbon is in buildings at the moment based on our algorithms is pretty good. Like we found that essentially GFA is a really good predictor. So how big is the building, gross floor area? It's a really good predictor for how much carbon will be in there, which is kind of obvious, but also does not hold true necessarily for things like energy. So when we're looking at energy or water, the size of the building can be quite disconnected from actually, you know, how much air conditioning it uses or something like that. Embodied carbon, pretty good relationship. So we've got that. And now we're starting to look at secondary correction. So we're looking at how high it is, you know, does it have a, you know, is a car park stacker something that's important? And, you know, like really going into quite a bit of detail. Does the type of soil that it's built on have an impact on how much carbon's on it? That's where we're in at the moment. We do a bunch of sensitivity testing on that too as we go. And again, that will be available in the new year. That's it from me. And I think at this point, it's a handover to, you know, like we've got the tool, it's launched, people are going to start certifying it from, you know, early next year, which is very exciting after working on it for 3 years. But what now we really need is some policy stuff. So I believe our next presenter is going to talk on that very topic. Thanks, Jeremy.
What a beautiful segue, James. Thank you for your presentation on the tool, and we'll come back to questions on the tool at the end of Alison's presentation. But as you said, what we really need now is some policy. And thankfully, ASBEC, the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, has been busy at work thinking about this exact issue, what a policy framework looks like for embodied carbon in Australia. So I'd like to introduce Alison Scotland, who is the CEO of ASBEC. And ASBEC is a body of peak organisations committed to a vision of more sustainable, productive and resilient buildings, communities and cities. Alison has a passion in collaborating across industry, government and not-for-profits. And prior to ASBEC, she was director at Partner Housing Australasia, a non-for-profit providing resilient housing across the Asia-Pacific region. And so, Alison, I'd like to hand the microphone to you now to tell us a little bit about the policy roadmap that you've been developing.
Thank you, Jeremy. And can you see my screen okay?
All good.
All good, fabulous. So fabulous segue. Thank you, James. I love it. It's like we discussed this order, but that's the whole thing. You know, we've established why we need to look at embodied carbon. We've got a tool and a tool that's going to be consistently applied across the country so that we can really look at what we need to do to benchmark and measure and assess performance and potentially look at targets. But what policy do we need to support that? So that's where ASBEC comes in. And we love the fact that we are such a genuine collaborator with our trusted government partners. And the beautiful thing about ASBEC is we represent a range of different industries within the built environment, all focused on what we need to do to enhance the sustainability and get that really big change at scale. So you would see the graph on the screen, eerily similar to what Jorge just showed you, talking about, you know, the why and the size of what it is that we need to do. So we launched, with the support of the federal government and NABERS, we launched a project this year to look at what we need to do in terms of that policy ecosystem to really ensure that the use of the NABERS tool is going to get that benefit at scale. The interesting thing about this is that it's a little bit different to, say, energy efficiency and operational carbon, because it's one of those things that it's not just looking at, you know, what's happening within a building. It's you know, you've got to be looking across the whole supply chain. You know, it's the biggest team sport that we need to tackle. So from a policy perspective, that's a bit of a challenge. So we came out with an issues paper. It was picking up from where the GBCA and ThinkStep started, the NABERS consultation uncovered. And what ASBEC did was we also looked at what Infrastructure Australia was doing in terms of their baselining and benchmarking. And we looked at, you know, the challenges and opportunities around embodied carbon policy, very much informed by quite a thorough scan around what's happening across the world in relation to embodied carbon policy. So you'll see a few statistics up there on the screen. We wanted to look and see what other countries were doing and how successful they were. So, you know, some countries in Europe, you know, they had policy around embodied carbon, you know, dating back a couple of decades. So, you know, what can we learn from what different countries around the world have been doing so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel or start from scratch? So we've come up with some very clear targets around what needs to happen. And not only that, a sense of urgency around getting it happening now. So like Jorge said, the buildings we're building now are going to be around for, you know, 50 to 100 years. Generally, that embodied carbon in the superstructure and substructure, you know, it's locked in. Once we've used it, we've used it. We know that, you know, even just putting a straight line between now and 2050 meaning we have to have reduced our embodied carbon to zero, that's a huge task, and we need to try and reduce that quite soon. So what does that mean? There's a lot of ways of achieving this. And, you know, Jeremy touched on that earlier. You know, a lot of it does relate to industrial decarbonisation. So it's a perfect opportunity for the built environment to signal to our value chain, to our supply chain, that we value them looking at their own abatement. But it's also an opportunity for the built environment sector to look at the way we design, to think about sufficiency, you know, think about the way we build buildings using the data that has been uncovered and is going to be uncovered by the use of this common tool and methodology. One of the big things is, you know, we're on that journey where we as an industry know what needs to happen, but we know that there are interventions that we require of government to help us on the way. Why 60% or at least 60%? So 60 to 70%, like I talked about, even if you just take a straight line from now until 2050, we know that by roughly 2035, we need to have reduced our buildings sort of 60 to 75%. We also need to be aware of the lag between building design and as built. So that line is thick for a reason, because it takes time to implement policy. It takes time to go from design to construct. So we need to be aware of all of these. And if you can see on the graph, it's just indicative, but if you can see, a lot of people think about reducing embodied carbon and they just go straight to, okay, we need to substitute everything we're doing with low carbon products. Yes, that is true, but that's not the whole story. And you can see that, you know, the two, the black and the grey line, they're lines just for, you know, steel and concrete, some of the bigger components of our embodied carbon in our buildings. They're decarbonisation journeys, and these are international journeys, just as an indication. You can tell, you know, they're only around sort of 20-30% of what we need to achieve. So how else do we get our reductions? How do we do it? There's so many opportunities to design out waste, to look at sufficiency better. So, you know, at the outset, up front, you know, in project conceptualization, that's where some of the biggest opportunities are for reducing our upfront embodied carbon emissions. So better planning and procurement. Absolutely, some targets around there, looking at how we design buildings, look at our use of material and resources. What do we need to do there? That said, supply chain is a huge thing, and we need to set in motion elements that are happening with the supply chain now so that we can help them on their decarbonisation journey. And obviously, another big part of that is with our grid decarbonising, we need to move to fossil fuel-free transport and construction. If we're looking at upfront as the A1 to A5 as part of that methodology, that's where we need to focus. So we need to look at all these levers, and each of them are equally important. What we do now versus what we might do later, that might change. So that's why we need a series of roadmaps related to each of the different segments or different levers in relation to how to get there. What we are hoping to publish very soon for all of you to have a look at and help us work it out is a series of roadmaps in each of the levers, what needs to happen now versus what we need to really expect and drive by 2035 to get the reductions that we need to see. So we've got this out within our ASBEC network. We're just consulting on these. They look detailed, but these are our high-level preliminary recommendations around what needs to happen, with the view that we've got a future comprehensive framework coming out early next year. So this particular set of recommendations will be coming out before Christmas. But we look forward to continuing to work with you all in relation to implementing policies that's really going to help drive change, because what we found through this journey is it's not as easy. It needs to happen, but it's not as simple as, say, setting requirements through our National Construction Code. There's a lot of supporting other policy that needs to complement each other, and also because we're talking about our supply chain, it also needs to talk across buildings and infrastructure, because, you know, concrete's concrete. We need to ensure that we're aligning, and it's wonderful that NABERS has been targeted at the national level for that consistency across buildings and infrastructure. And we're really excited to see how that translates across the built environment. So I'll leave it there, stop sharing, and throw back to Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Alison. Very exciting to see that we're going to soon have the first of what looks like a series of policy roadmaps for the different levers that can be pulled to solve this problem. And maybe we can get into, I don't know, some of the if you're comfortable with it, a bit of a preview of some of the sort of ideas at a high level, perhaps, that we might be seeing. Before we do that, though, maybe I'll start with, and if all of the panelists want to come off, yeah, thank you. What's the word for muting your or having your camera off? Anyway, if you come off camera mute, Jorge, you had a slide in there talking about the fact that this is not just an Australian issue. There are various international bodies calling for action to manage our embodied carbon, and got me thinking about companies who occupy commercial buildings in particular in Australia. To what extent are you seeing demand from those international companies to be situated in commercial buildings that are taking into account of their embodied carbon? Is there a demand side drive coming from those companies that have an international obligation to reduce their emissions and the emissions of the premises that they exist in? That I understand that sometimes happens in the operational emission side. I'm wondering if it's also starting to flow through to demand for low embodied carbon buildings.
So the answer is indirectly yes, because a lot of these companies have used things like, say, Green Star in their leasing requirements, and now you don't have a choice. So there's when you have, say, I won't even go international companies, right? But when you have something like, say, Commonwealth Bank saying we will only occupy 4, 5, or 6-star rated assets, depending on the asset class, then essentially it means that for you to now get a Green Star rating, you have to deal with the upfront carbon question. And that's part of the reason why we've done it that way, is because say back in 2019, 2020, it was hard for someone to be able to say, I will occupy the building with a lower upfront carbon amount because it stands up the same way as the other building, right? At least with energy efficiency, you could see that there was a lower cost and so on and so forth, right? Like there were direct benefits to you. So through Green Star, we've been able to now, I think, drive that demand for low carbon products. Now, I do think, I do think that's changed now. There's likely, especially now with the introduction of the NABERS Embodied Carbon tool, the ratings, that does mean that you can actually now directly target it. And so you can now say, not only do I want, say, a building with a 6-star Green Star rating or 5-star or whatever it is, but you can now say, I also want a NABERS 5-star or 6-star energy performing building and a NABERS X-star, depending on what the scale looks like for my embodied carbon developments. We are expecting that to happen. We see that overseas, for example, where embodied carbon has now become something that companies or some companies really care about. So we know from talking to some of the tech companies that they now have specific embodied carbon requirements in the infrastructure activities that they put forward. We know, and we have been talking a lot about buildings, but embodied carbon also impacts the infrastructure sector. So there are government requirements overseas for lower embodied carbon. And there are also incentives now being built around lower embodied carbon. If I can just maybe briefly step back and say where the demand is coming in very strongly, unquestionably, is very much on the investment and financing side. That went from non-existent to very existent very quickly. And we do see that reflected in the types of questions we get asked from investors when they sort of come to us and say, why should I use Green Star instead of something else? Or what benefits do I get? And the moment we start talking about the requirements about upfront carbon, their eyes get very big and they go, great, that solves a problem for me. Because that is something that they are directly being impacted by in terms of regulations from Treasury or something.
Yeah, I was going to say, so that policy driver for investors, are we talking about climate-related financial disclosure and then voluntary things like the ASBEC taxonomy?
Yes. Yeah, it's that climate disclosure aspect. A lot of them also have their own internal targets, right? So they're looking at what that looks like. I think also investors have gotten a lot more sophisticated, so that now they understand differently that it's not just enough to just say, give me a big number for carbon, but rather they ask very specific questions. So to your point, Jeremy, about like the stuff that we're all working on, they no longer say how energy efficient your building is. They now say how energy efficient your building is and does it have gas? Because the gas question for them is now material and relevant, even though technically it's a portion of the question of how energy efficient your building is or how emissions efficient your building is. And that's what we're seeing throughout. And that level of sophistication about going to the next level of detail means that now they're asking, what is the upfront carbon amount that I'm sort of inheriting in the investment that I'm doing now? And that matters to them because they will have decarbonization targets or curves that they have to comply with, of which embodied carbon is a significant portion of.
Talking about international policy and drivers, Alison, you had a slide there showing that you looked at a bunch of things that were going on internationally. And I'd like to say, ask if you could tell us a little bit about which jurisdictions you feel, when you looked at that landscape, we're doing a pretty good job on this, or is it that we're all starting from scratch at the same time and we're all having to muddle through it, and maybe Australia's at the leading edge? But you're interested in any reflections on the research that came out when you did that scan?
I would say that Australia has the benefit of having international pilots to actually go, okay, you know what, that's good, but we would tweak it this way. That's also good. Let's take all these different bits. So, you know, in terms of advancement, like, you know, we had a wonderful guest from Denmark. They are so far advanced. They have so many, like they have decades of data related to embodied carbon, and they're being really stringent with their targets. But that's because they have the luxury of not having much of an operational emissions profile to get down. So we almost have to be building our plane while flying it. So we've still got some huge challenges. We've still got a lot of policy and action to roll out to reduce our operational emissions. But at the same time, we also need to be thinking about embodied carbon. So we need to be doing all of them. And I think, you know, some countries describe whole of life. It's one of those things where, you know, someone says whole of life and it might imply sort of trading off. So, well, I can, you know, save here and, you know, don't have to do this down the line. It's, you know, at every stage you need to be reducing. That's what whole of life means. So we absolutely need to be targeting embodied carbon. The great thing for Australia is any sort of policy requires signalling. So signalling by way of voluntary measurement and consistent measurement. Tick, hooray, thank you, NABERS, and a tool to do that. Then it comes into that mandatory measurement stage where we collect the data, because the data is really important, so that we can then set our benchmarks or targets, like reduction targets. So that's, you know, every country, no matter what goes through that process. In relation to supporting policy, there's pockets of brilliance from all over the world. Say the US has its Buy Clean Act, and what they do there is they actually incentivize and provide support for manufacturers to go through an EPD process. So the more information they get, you know, what's measured is managed, they can actually do more EPDs and get their abatement down. In London, it takes it at the very starting level in relation to design. They've got a policy, say with London City, where you know, you have to, if you're trying to do brownfield development, you have to, you know, go through all these hoops to demonstrate why you can't use an existing building. So I think it's a beautiful array of different policy inspiration we can get from across the world.
Thanks, Alison. And you mentioned EPDs in the US, and this maybe is a nice segue to James. When you were presenting, James, you talked about the lack of EPDs and the need, therefore, for these default factors. Can you just explain a little bit about like the process there when you were starting to put together the tool? What were you looking for when it comes to EPDs in Australia? What were you looking for? What did you find? And then, like, how did you then move on to this idea of default factors, I suppose? And were there any tricky ones in particular that you kind of struggled with that were quite difficult?
I mean, that's the problem with having lots of material categories. They're all difficult, but in their own ways. So we could go down the rabbit hole on that, but I promise that I won't. I think what we heard from it is like there's different ways you can measure carbon. You can measure it economy-wide, and you can kind of do it process all the way from counting all the little bits, which is kind of what an EPD is. You can do something that kind of mixes and matches, but the benefit of an EPD is that it's not an average, it's for a specific product. And what that means is if you've got concrete and if you're just using an average, it's like, well, concrete's concrete. But if you're using specific products, you can actually say, well, concrete from that batching plant has got this much carbon, and from this other batching plant, it's got this lower amount of carbon. Let's use that one, do the cost analysis. So that's what EPDs allow, and they're internationally consistent. And there are some, they're not perfect. There's definitely inconsistencies between the way EPDs arrive at. Measuring embodied carbon is not a precise science, like reading a meter on a building like we do for energy. But they're the best that we have. They allow us to compare different products. Now, to your question, we have to the EPDs first you can go somewhere and get a concrete that you might, what's the worst thing that you might do or pick up? What's the worst piece of gyprock you might put in? And then that's the value you get. So no matter what EPD you're using, you're always being better off by choosing a product that you know the emissions of. You're not just buying anything from anywhere and you don't know what it is. Because to your first point, and it was repeated by Alison, if you can't manage it if you don't measure it. So if you don't have a number, you're making it up. Yeah.
Indeed, it's a lesson we've learned very much from the energy efficiency world, and still struggling with. So hopefully it's an easier push in the embodied carbon world. Jorge, we were talking about international lessons, and I want to come back to you on that because you've been in this space for a long time as well. In terms of collaboration that Australia could, strike up with other countries who have done this, Alison mentioned Denmark as a leading example, some parts of the US. What sort of collaboration would you like to see to drive action in Australia?
Oh, that's a awesome question. One of them, there's several that I guess we've been involved in some of them. We've seen action elsewhere. One of probably the key challenges about the upfront carbon problem or the embodied carbon problem is that it relies on information about a supply chain that is genuinely global. And there's a lot of stuff that gets manufactured in Australia, and if all we focus was on, say, elements in Australia, we'd do well. And I can't remember, Alison, but I think you guys have found a statistic which I think is really eye-opening in terms of how much of a building or how much of a building it comes from products manufactured overseas, and it's something like 60%, correct, or something like that, right, Alison? You're on mute. Sorry. Yes, you're saying yes, great. And if you think about that problem, then very quickly you realize that this is not just an Australian problem, it's an international collaboration problem. So we've been working with our colleagues overseas, our equivalents in the US Green Building Council, BRE, the Building Research Establishment, and trying to say, well, we're all tackling the same problem. Can we try and help people understand and try and drive action on certain areas in at least, we're not going to say necessarily exactly the same way, but at least that the sense of direction is similar. And that matters, right? That's helpful for us to be able to say we need EPDs. And so we have seen it in LEED and BREEAM and Green Star and a bunch of the other schemes. There's a drive for EPDs. We want to be able to say not only, I think the next step for us, and from my perspective, what I'd love to be able to say is we no longer only care about EPDs, but we want reduction in EPDs and a reduction on carbon shown in EPDs. So we'd love to have some form of like an easy way of identifying that, because EPDs are just numbers. And if you don't know how to read an EPD, to be honest, there might as well be random number generators, right? They're just numbers everywhere. So you can't tell from looking at an EPD if it's a good EPD or a good product or a bad product. It just gives you a number. And so can we have some extra information from the EPD providers to be able to tell us these things? That's the type of action collaboration that we'd like to see there. I think there's also an element that Alison spoke about, that it's not just though the materials question, the amount of stuff going in materials. So I think you will see more collaboration and thought. I think about the problem of how much we build, because that is a big portion of what we do, and that is just hard to measure, right? As I'm fond of saying, I'm always not constructing a building, right? That is easy. Right now, I am not doing that. But so when does the intention of not building something become actually real is a hard thing to measure. If I am not going to demolish a building, I am not doing that right now. All of us, right now, we're not demolishing buildings. So when does it become an intention where there's a genuine benefit? It's a hard question to answer and a hard question to measure. The reference building model that we use until we get the final NABERS benchmarks, and even the NABERS benchmarks, don't quite help with that question. They are only based on what you were going to build, but it would be great to be able to say, well, how do we then reduce amounts? Like, we're not the only ones that we're dealing with that. There's a big program happening internationally with the UN called the Buildings Breakthrough, where we're kind of tackling some of that. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's moving in that space. And ultimately is the fact that the bigger one right now is the fact that it's a global supply chain and we do need to engage with it. And it's really hard. The amount of information, as James has said, on some of the building products we all rely on is tiny. When you think about mechanical systems and fixtures and fittings, I could put them in a trapper keeper, like the amount of like EPDs that exist, and still have leftover space, right? Like that's what we're talking about, and that's a shame because there should be a lot more, and they don't exist. So we have to drive that.
You referenced Alison's point around sufficiency. I think was the word you used, Alison, and that was an eye-opening one for me. That point you made, because yeah, like you said, I think our default, those of us who aren't engaged in this on a day-to-day basis, probably think, okay, we need to swap out traditional concrete with concrete with clinker substitutes, and we have steel manufactured using hydrogen or whatever. But you talked about design and waste, and Jorge just framing it as, do we need to build this building, or maybe it's like, can this building last another 20-30 years? And every year that it's standing around for, maybe it's its embodied carbon profile looks better and better. My question to you then is, do you think that policies for things like waste and the circular economy are currently there, and are they pulling in the same direction as our sort of decarbonisation policies, or is there work needed to sort of align things?
Definitely more work needed. However, I feel like this embodied carbon work might be able to connect them a bit more, because, if you think about it, circular economy, if you apply circular economy principles, even when you're looking at the upfront carbon reduction, you're going to win. It's like in that sort of concept stage, it's how long can you sweat an asset for? Do we need to sort of rethink the way we keep and maintain buildings and their lifestyle? Do we imply penalties? I've been in forums where an engineer has said, oh, well, we just need to design bridges with 400-year lifespans, and that's going to fix everything. And it's like, well, if you do that, then there needs to be penalties if society changes their mind and decides, oh, we don't need that bridge, let's knock it down and do something else. So, I think it's a very long way of saying we need to tackle it in a systemic way. I think looking at something like waste policy or even recycling policy separately is damaging. Circular economy is not recycling. recycling is, you know, the lowest form, you know, we look at the circular economy sort of value sort of pump. Recycling is the last thing we need to be thinking about it. It's, you know, we need to keep our buildings in you know, in use, in effective use longer, and what policies can we do to actually encourage that more? And I think, you know, talking about the challenges that Jorge said, you know, we're a growing population, so we will need to build more houses. Like that's, you know, it's not necessarily a decision, well, we can't build that house. Like we need to house our population. It's what can we do, or how can we do that in a better way? Are there housing designs or multi-residential designs that build communities better, that encourage, you know, so many more wins than just looking at carbon alone. So I think it's we're not necessarily in the same direction yet, but this is an opportunity to get them in the same direction. And Jorge, I'll pass to you because I know you've got something
No,
valuable.
I was just going to add, because you gave the example of the 400-year-old bridge, which I think I always find like a very interesting situation. Because obviously, yes, we have to build things so that they last. And we definitely have to do that. That's not a question. But we also should be really careful about not overbuilding things, because we don't know what the future looks like. And we see it over and over again. We keep going into, you mentioned earlier, right, us on the question of whole life carbon. And that tends to be misunderstood as like, oh, well, if I decrease my end of life emissions by increasing my upfront carbon, and the net emissions are lower, that's a great thing, except we don't know what the future looks like, and you are assigning a lot of value to that future. And we have a 25-year problem of a carbon budget that is genuinely limited. Also, you're not making that assumption of you're making that assumption of the future based on what we know today, not what will actually happen. So while we still have to consider all of those stages, and we really should, we stress a lot the upfront carbon question because it's a genuine, real thing. And we should try and make things last longer. That is not a question. And we should look at how we take things that already exist and not demolish them. That is unquestionably the right thing to do. But we should also be very honest to ourselves about the fact that we cannot predict what 60 years looks like, and be very careful about assigning changes to emissions then for today's emissions. And just treat them as separate buckets. They are both important, but they're separate buckets. And I think that's really important to always remember. I think someone described this to me, and I thought that was a very clever analogy. And the only reason why we mix all of this stuff is because they're all CO2. And on a mathematical question, you can, but they really shouldn't be treated as CO2. It's like you walked into a warehouse and someone was like, well, what I have is a ton of water vapor, and a ton of ice, but they're all water, so you have 3 tons of water. And you go, yeah, but it's not really useful, right? Like that wasn't useful information when you told me I had 3 tons of water. And that's important. We have to be very clear about what we're trying to do. Otherwise, we run the risk of making the wrong choices both ways, right? Like by just focusing on upfront carbon, you may run the risk of making wrong choices, but also by focusing on whole of life, you can make wrong choices if you're not careful.
That's a really interesting point, Jorge. And language matters clearly. You know, the use of the word upfront carbon instead of embodied maybe is an important distinction that we.
Oh man, I have a great story about that one actually.
Well, unfortunately, it's going to have to wait. I think,
because James has to say something.
James, do you have something to say before we do wrap things up?
No, I think it's time to wrap things up. But I would just say to everybody, like, you know, the people on this call are like, you know, you're here, so you're smart, sustainability professional of some kind. It's our job to find the balance between these things, to not knock down the building and not build and just not be rewarded for that. So, you know, when you're building, to be rewarded for that, to balance off carbon now and carbon later. And it's hard, but I think it shows commitment that people are showing up and trying the best they can. So well done.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's a nice note to end on. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today on this really interesting topic. It looks like it's fast moving as well. So keep an eye out for ASBEC's policy roadmap coming out next year. And then the next iteration of the NABERS tool as well. I think James has put out a call for people to sign up to be assessors. So if any of you on the call are interested in that, please put your hand up or scan the QR code I think that James had on screen and do that, because the more assessors the better. We'll be leaving you now. This is our last webinar of the year, but we'll have plenty of webinars coming up in 2025 at the EEC. I believe, well, we're probably going to try and start off with the IEA, who will come and present on their latest energy efficiency market report, which contains global trends for energy performance. So looking forward to that one, and we'll have some promos out in the new year for that. So thank you very much, Alison, James, and Jorge for joining us. I really appreciate your insights this afternoon, and yeah, thank you again, and see you in the next one.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.